Hi friends, welcome to Tech Arkit YouTube channel. My name is Ravi. In this video session, we are going to see AWS certified cloud practitioner course. In the next video is about IAM, the AWS security code service. So basically, what is security and why do we need to secure the environment? So that's the first of all, the you need to understand what is the security criteria here and what is the options and why you need to secure these options. So here customer responsibility is to security in the cloud. The customers are responsible for securing the applications, data and operating system they run on top of AWS infrastructure. This includes data encryption, access controls, network security, application security, and patch management. So we already see that some of the shared responsibilities between the customer and the cloud. What are the security responsibilities, the shared responsibilities you have on the cloud? You have to always keep in mind that. So the data encryption method is your responsibility, access controls is your responsibility, configuring the firewalls, web firewalls or the firewall rules, network security settings, that's your responsibility on the AWS cloud, and providing your application security like writing the code, developing the code in a secure manner is your responsibility, and doing your servers patch management is your responsibility on the cloud. So it depends on the model, which model you are using on the cloud, but these are the major responsibility of the customer. They have to do it. A lot of the security news around that, like companies are being hacked, customer data is being stolen, like they say that the Facebook data is hacked and it's available on the darknet, or the Twitter handles are hacked and available for some rate on the dark web. So this is companies are hacked and hearing so many news on the security side. To avoid such things, like if you are developing your company from the few years, your product and everything is going smooth, but all of this sudden if someone hacks your company's data and stole the company's secrets or the intellectual property, then your company goes vanished. So that's why it's very important that you should keep your data secure, you should keep your data backup. So that's the major one. So do your necessary action to keep your access safe and secure. Let's see what is IAM. So this is a major core service on the AWS identity and access management. IAM is web service that helps you securely control access to AWS resources. With IAM, you can create and manage AWS users and groups and apply granular permissions to resources so that only authorized users can access them. So that is the major thing. But most of the people, they do not understand what is that granular permissions here. The granular permissions means the least privileges first. Provide the least privileges first. Later, if the user complains they need some additional permissions, you can add that. But most of the times, the administrators or the management of the security people, they just provide, oh, you are the user, here you go, you have a full access to the environment. Then that is not the good practice at all, but that's the major issue with the most of the administrators or the user who actually manage the security stuff. IAM is a core component of AWS security and it is essential for organizations that wanted to use AWS in a secure and compliant way. That's the IAM goal. So it can provide you this centralized control, like where you can control everything from the single interface. Fine grained permissions. So it just like what is the permission level the user need, that level you can control the permissions, or you can granularly provide the permissions to that particular user. So that's called a fine grade permissions. And multi-factor authentication, example, say your username and password is stolen, but still if you have the multi-factor authentication, the user cannot log into the services or the console access, or they cannot access the data until unless they have the multi authentication codes or multi authentication fingerprints. Okay, so that's the secure way to do that. Integration with other AWS services. So whenever you are doing any service integration from service to service, so you don't need to actually use the access keys and the access ID and keys, right, for the credentials. You can always use the roles, which is the granular permissions from service to service. You can provide the access. Compliance auditing, so it's actually have the, if you enable the access analyzer, the IAM access analyzer, which actually keep a monitoring of all the users who are having the access on IAM AWS console. They have the monitoring, compliance and auditing in this place, so that you get what user is doing what, granularly set those permissions. And it also suggests you that okay, this user is not using so and so service from the so many days, so you can just eliminate that service for his access. So what is identity and access? If you wanted to see in a granular way, what is that? Identity refers to who a person is. Basically the user means the identity. So his identity is what? So if you physically say that hey, is Ravi, but who knows who is Ravi, right? It has some identity, identification, right? Example, if you are a Indian citizen, who are you? Then you have some other identification number, so that's called identifies you as Indian citizen. Like identity means you have some ID with associated with that particular name of the user. It could be their name, email address, employee ID, or any other attribute that uniquely identifies them. So that's the information of identity. Access. What is access? Access on other hand refers to the permissions or privileges that a person has within a system or organization. Access controls dictate what a person cannot do within a system based on their identity and other factors such as their role or job function. Example, say that if you are a developer, so you have a developer access to the resources. If you are a manager, maybe you have a access to the manager level. So that's the access. What is authentication? So authentication is a process of verification that identity of user or a system in AWS users are authenticated through their credentials such as username and password. And if you have the enable the multi-factor authentication, username and password, and as well as the authentication code. Authorization. So what does authorization here? Authorization on the other hand is the process of granting or denying access to specific resources or actions based on a user's identity and the permissions assigned to the user. What is the authorization like? So you are a Linux administrator, so I am authorizing you to use EC2 instance access, the full access to EC2 services. Then you can use launch the EC2 instance and stop the EC2 instance, terminate the EC2 instance, and provide the EBS, create the EBS volumes, expand the EBS volumes, snapshots and all, right? So that's called as an authorization to that particular user identified as a Linux administrator. In AWS, authorization is controlled by IAM policies, which are used to specify the resources and actions that a user or system is authorized to access. That's the example. So if you create the identity, example, the user is created and access is provided, but you are not authorized to do, then you should author the policies. So that's the authorization here. So let's see what is actually the user in terms of the AWS. If you take it, a user is an individual or entity that interacts with a system, software or application. A user can be a person, a group of people, or even another software system. So another software system is, example, say that the EC2 service wanted to write some data. The EC2 instance wanted to write some data to S3 buckets. So here there is no person is involved. The EC2 is a software system where it wanted to write some data to the S3 bucket. So that is a programmatic user access. That's why you can also say even another software system is a user. So if you see that what are the users we have on AWS, like types of users normally you have is a root user account, a normal user account, and the application user account. Like root user accounts, whenever you create the AWS account, it might be organization account or the free tier account or whatever the account you create, with that's called as a root account privileges you get. Like with that account you can do anything on that particular AWS account, like providing the access controls, building access, everything you can do with that account. But that's not suggested to use for a regular use. So any root user account should be enabled with MFA. So if your user is compromised, you can still have the root access to control that user, but if your root user is compromised, then you cannot do anything. So that's the way the root user should be have a strong security policy, strong password, MFA enabled, and it should not be exposed to the any other user access. So that's the one. A normal user accounts, it might be like a person user account or the global people account or even a software system account, anything. Application user account, so application is something like it's not a physical user, it's just like an application user where they have the programmatic access. So that's the user access types. So if you see the groups, you have the groups. So what are those groups here? In AWS IAM, a group is a collection of IAM users. A group makes it easy to manage permissions for multiple users at once. Instead of defining permissions for each user individually, you can create a group, assign the appropriate permissions to the group, and then add users to the group as needed. Example, you have a developers group. All the developers should have the similar access to do their job. So in organizations, the people comes in, people goes away. Then whenever the people go away, what you can do is that you can just remove that IAM user from that particular group, then the access will be revoked. If a new user joined, you don't need to set up again redefine the permissions again and again. Just create the user account and add that user account to the group, then you will have the good access, the similar access what all the developers have. So that way you can manage all the developers will have the same permissions to the AWS console. What is the group? So how the groups looks like? So you have the group name, and there will be a multiple users added to this group, so that the group will have the assign the policies or the permissions. Then whatever the user you add to that particular group will get the similar permission what other user get on the same group. Role. So role is a AWS identity and access management entity that defines a set of permissions for making AWS service request. Unlike an IAM user or group, a role is not associated with a specific user or group. Instead, a role defines a set of permissions that can be assumed by a user, group, or AWS service. So that's the IAM role is. A role can be assumed by anyone who has been granted permissions to assume that role. Example, say you are a normal person, then for one day you are a policeman, like you are wearing the police dress and police cap, and you provided the permissions to do the police job. So that way you are wearing that role, you are in that role, so that you are performing that role actions. So that way, whenever you create the role and assign that role to the any of the resources or users or group, they get a permissions until the role is revoked, or assume that they are doing that access. Like example, if you are an administrator but you want a developer access, so you don't need to be added to the group which actually developers have. So temporarily they create a role access, and the role will be assigned to that particular user, so that the user becomes a developer access until unless you have that session timeout. So that's the assuming that you are a developer until you are wearing that cap. This allows you to grant access to AWS resources to users or applications that are not otherwise authenticated to your AWS account. For example, you might create a role that allows an EC2 instance to access S3 bucket, or a role that allows a developer to access a specific set of AWS services for testing or development process. So this way, what you can do is, it will be not a user, it's a programmatic access or the service access. So the EC2 service want to access S3 bucket, then you can create a role and put a cap on that EC2 instance. The EC2 instance can write the data to S3 bucket. So that we can see on this practically on this session. Providing the least privileges, that's the IAM roles will work in similar way. That's the best practices for the security. And temporary credentials, so it's a temporary credentials. Example, say that sometimes some users wanted a temporary access to do some job, but most of the times we provide a temporary access, but we forgot to revoke that access. So that way the user will have the same access to the permanent way. But this role, assigning the role to that particular user, will be in a temporary credentials for him. A cross account access, example, you have the multiple accounts on the AWS, you can provide the access to the cross account for using the role. Service linked roles, so the service can be linked, like example, EC2 wanted to write the data to S3 bucket, or Lambda wanted to execute some functions on EC2 instance. You can provide the linked access to those services using the role. So let's see what is the security principles here. The principle of least privileges is fundamental concept in information security that requires that a user or process be given only the minimum level of access and permissions necessary to perform their required job function. So remember that any time you are giving any access to any of the users, right, you should give a minimum access to do their job. So not required to provide any additional permissions. Example, say, hey, he is my favorite manager, I would like to give full access to him, right? So it might be favorite, he is a favorite for you, but his job role does not to be a favorite for the company, right? So that why, what is the function of his job role? Then provide those permissions, required permissions to work for her or him. Okay, so this principle is also known as the principle of least authority, or the principle of minimal privilege. How it is basically works, the policy, so what the policy you define, the policy will be applied to the group, and add the users to that particular group. So what are the policies assigned to that particular group will be effective to that users. Example here, if you see here what I'm doing, the statement is saying that effective allow. So I'm saying that in this policy, allowing action is listing the buckets. So listing the bucket access I am providing in this policy, and say what is the resource here. So if you specify the resource, like example bucket, so the bucket name is example underscore bucket, I am providing that particular bucket access to this group. So who are the users of this group will have this access. Say allow S3 listing bucket. So listing the bucket access they have and to this example bucket. So that's a granular level permissions, granular level policy we are providing to that particular group of IAM users. So what are the security best practices you have to follow? So one is use multi-factor authentication. Always any user account you create, use the multi-factor authentication. Create strong password policies. Example, like you should have the minimum password length is 15 characters. You should have a small letter, big letter, special character, one number, so that it will be a complex password or strong password. Implement least privileges. So provide the permissions what the role demands or the role required to do the job. That's the minimum least privileges policy. And use security groups and network ACLs. So do not actually provide the permissions like individual users. So you might it might not be consistent for all the users if you do that. So either you assign the create the policy, the security group policies, and add the users to that groups. So you will have the all the similar permissions to be the multiple users. Enable encryption. Encryption might be like in transit or in rest. So like while you are transferring the data from one location to the another location, you should use the encryption method, just like HTTPS or SSH or any other security FTPS, something like that. Then the data should be secured, and in rest the data should be encrypted enough. If somebody stolen your data, they should not able to see the data. That's the encryption will enable you to protect your data from the unauthorized access. Implement access logging and monitoring. Like example, who are accessing, what they are accessing, you should have always logging that, so that you could able to identify, review those logs or monitor those access. Then if you find any anomalies or if you have any algorithms like identifying the patterns of access management, then you can identify unauthorized access or unauthorized logins to the consoles or any services. Use AWS management services. So basically managed services will have more security controls because the AWS continuously do their improvements, the code developments, patches, security updates, hardware updates, physical security and everything. So that most of the times wherever it is applicable, use AWS management services. So that would be more secure way to do the AWS cloud native services. Regular review and audit of security, so that the one, so most of the people will not have a regular monitoring on the security, so that they don't identify who access the what and what level of access they have. So that if you review at least a monthly once or the quarterly once, then you will have the review mechanism in place. Then you can identify if any unauthorized user access levels, you can granularly revoke those access and permit the access the way the organization want in a secure manner with the least privileges rule. So that's the method. So let's jump into the practical session and see how we can create the users, groups, roles, and assign the role to the service. Okay, let's see here how can we create the users and groups policies and assign the roles to the particular service to perform certain actions, right? So how we can do that? Here you have to go to IAM in the search bar. If you type IAM, click on this IAM, identity and access management. So it will load the console. Here you can see that there are certain users groups is already available here. You can see. Now if you go and click on the users, first actually we'll create the users, then add that to the group. Say add user. Here the provide the username. What is the username you would like to provide here? Let's say my username is going to be techarkit1, and say do you need a access to the console. Let's say provide user access to the AWS management console, and specify the user identity sender recommended, it says. But I want IAM user to be created. I want to create the IAM user here, and say if you want to auto generate the password, it can be auto generated, or if you want to provide the custom password, you can click on here and provide the custom password. Okay, and say user must create the new password and next to sign in. So once sign in, it will ask you to reset the user password for the first time. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to click next here and add users to the group. If you want to select the group here, you can select that, but as of now I don't want it to do that. Okay, let's continue with that, right? Next, now here is my user, and this role is assigned to that particular user to change the password once user is logged into the console. So now what I'm saying, purpose of this is going to be a demo purpose, and say tag, I just say create the user, and you have to download this credential report, the credential file, otherwise you won't get the credential. So return to the user list. So now you can see the user techarkit1 is created, but it does not have any groups or any policies associated with that user. Okay, so what you have to do, so in order to provide the permissions, either you can create the policy and assign to that user, or create the group and create the policy and assign to the group, and add that user to the group. So that way you can do that. So to do that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one more user to check that what is the permissions we'll have here. I say I just create the similar access, right? Then next, so I just say create the user here. So I have created the two users and downloaded their credentials. Now go to user, so it does not have any group list here. There is no group is added to that one. Just go to users and group. Now say create group. I'm going to create the group here. So my group name is going to be Linux administrators, and say who are the users going to be there on that particular group is techarkit1, techarkit2 is the one which are going to there on that particular one, and say what is the access you required for that. So AWS administrator access, which I'm looking for. So you say that administrator access, AWS managed job function, provide full access to the AWS services and resources. These two accounts will have the full access. Say create the group. So now you can see the Linux administrators has been created, and two users has been added to that one, techarkit1, techarkit2, and the policies assigned to that particular group, which is, you can see the permissions. What are the permissions you have? Administrator access. If you expand that, what is the policy you have here? So it's say effective allow, I'm allowing the policy here, and actions, all the actions they can do. And what is the resource limitation here? There is no resource limitation, all the resources, all the actions and all the resources, which means that those two users can do anything on this particular console. Okay, so this is access advisory. Whenever you are log into those users and check that login, then you can verify that so how many services the user is accessed, how many services it does not access. So by the time it will show you the details, then you can revoke the access which are not accessed from the long time, so that the access advisory works here. So now what I'm going to do here, I have created the human account and provided the access, but now I wanted to create the role where I don't have any user. I wanted to access the EC2 would access the S3 bucket which write the data to that. How you can do that? Let's say create the role and to the AWS service. Now say EC2 is going to access some service here. So let's say EC2 and next go and S3 full access I'm looking for. Let's say Amazon S3 full access, which is going to be S3 access will be assigned. Let's say S3 full access to EC2 instance. That's the my role name, and say what is the purpose of this one. Purpose is going to be a particularly role demo role, which is going to be, it's a demo purpose. I'm creating this one and say create the role here. Now you can see which is going to create the role. The role has been created. You can see the S3 EC2 instance has been created. S3 full access to EC2 instance has been created. Now how can you assign that role? So you have to put the cap on EC2 so that the EC2 can access the S3 bucket. So go to security and modify the role, IAM role, and say S3 full access to EC2 instance. This is the role, so I'm assigning to that particular instance. You can see now the role has been attached here. Now let's go to the account settings. So which where you can select the policies for the users and groups, like the password policies, how strong you set that policies and all. So here you can see password policy and click here and say IAM default is this one. So 8 characters, 1 upper character, lower character, numbers and non-alphabetic numbers. Never expire the password. Must notice the must not to be identical to your user account, something like that, right? So you can say custom. If you want to increase your security, say 15 characters required on uppercase, lowercase, 1 number and special characters. Turn on the password expiry. So how many days the password should expiry, say maybe 45 days or 90 days, whatever it is. Password expiry allows user to change their own password. Prevent password reuse. So how many times the password can be reused. So how many last passwords can be reused? 3 passwords cannot be, last 3 passwords cannot be reused. Let's say save settings. So it will ask you to section for the selection. You can say set custom. Now your password policy has been changed. You have to change the all the users password to author this policy settings, otherwise it won't accept the password. And click on that particular user and see access advisory. You can see that it will show you that what are the user has accessed. You can see detailed information like EC2 accessed, IAM, CloudWatch, organizations, health APIs, notifications, AWS support. So these are all the user is accessed today. So there are so many things you can see that. So when it is accessed and when it is, see that. So this is the access advisory, will give you the more detail of the user is, what user is accessed. So you can also use the credential report. So if you download the credential report, this will provide you the how the users are managing. So what are the users are there, how many users. So this is the credentials reports. You can see that what are the users are there, their ARN details and when it is created, whether the password is enabled or not. Okay, password when it is last used, password last changed, password next rotation date, MFA, whether the MFA is enabled or not on particular user account or not, and what are the access keys and details. This is the credential report, where if you have multiple users and so many users, you can simply identify that the users logged in date and all. If the user is not logged in from so long, then you can disable the user and keep this account secure, which can be used, the credential report can be used in such a way. So let's see how you can enable the MFA to the particular user here. So if you go to the user and click on that particular user and say enable without MFA, you can see that the console access, you can see enable without MFA here. So click on this red one and say enable MFA. Now it will ask you that which one you would like to provide that access, like which one, like you want to use the authenticator app, security key if you have the device, or the hardware TOTP token. So hardware TOTP token means you have to purchase the token and attach you to your hardware system. So here what I'm doing, I say my mobile and authenticator app, I'm going to use it, and say next. Now it will show you the QR code. You have to scan the QR code here. So now click on place and see here it's MFA. You have to type this MFA number and just wait. It will give you the one more MFA in few seconds. So now enter the another code which it has generated and say add MFA. So now your MFA has been enabled. So once you log into the console, it will ask you for the MFA code. So you have to go to your authenticator app and whatever the code is generated, you have to provide that MFA there. So then you can log into that particular account.